Now it's my enormous privilege to introduce our keynote speaker, Melissa Clark-Reynolds. And again, as I said earlier, it's just so amazing experience when you ring someone sort of super fangirl style and say, do you think you'd come and speak at this thing we're having in Nelson? And she says yes right away. So I can't thank Melissa enough. Melissa is a visionary and a certified futurist. And I have been full of respect for her for a very long time. And yeah, I think she's the perfect person to inspire us and allow us to lift our eyes above the parapet and to really think about what is coming towards us like a freight train. What are things, we're all busy doing the do every day, grinding away, and sometimes it's nice just to take some time and be reminded of the big picture stuff that we should be thinking about. And I think the opportunity for us to start the day with Melissa and then have lots of time together, hearing from industry, talking to people who are researching, I think it's a really special day. So Melissa will present and then there'll be lots of chance for Q&A. So hold your questions till the end. And I'd like to welcome Melissa.
Kia ora mai tātou mahinui ki a koutou, ki te runga rāua, rā ko papatunu ku tēnā rā, ki mātua me kia koe, ki ngā mana whenua tēnei rohi mihano. Thanks for having me. It's quite funny, I was sitting there, it was a bit spooky because one of the things, I retrained as a futurist a few years ago. I was at one of those points in your life where, my youngest had gone off to university and I was trying to decide what I was going to do with my life. And I ended up doing some work for Lincoln University, and sorry if there's anyone from accounting from Lincoln here, but they couldn't afford to pay me. And so we cut a deal and they sent me to the Te Hono program, which was at Stanford University, which was designed for the primary sector. And so I worked off my scholarship. Was one of those sort of creative ways of, we don't have money here, but we can pay you to do something else. It's like, cool. And so while I was at Stanford, we spent half a day with the Institute for the Future. And I was like, oh my God, this brings together so much of my career in a way that would be really perfect for me to think about what I'd do next. And so 2 weeks later, I'd taken myself back to the Institute for the Future and I certified with them as a futurist. And since then, I've certified with 2 other international kind of futurist agencies. And one of the key things that they kind of drum into you, no matter which set of disciplines futurists use, is this idea of looking back to look forwards. And I was sitting there and my 20-something-year-old me was just getting more and more excited. And so part of why the 20-year-old me was getting more and more excited is that I was going to do, I thought I was going to be an engineer. And then I ended up meeting Tati Paneo Regan, and I was 15 and it completely changed the direction of my life. I ended up doing an anthropology degree instead and honours in anthropology. And then I went and worked as an anthropologist, which I have to say was probably the most grinding, miserable experience of my life. And so I was sent to the back blocks of New Guinea by sort of do-gooding aid agency, and I was supposed to hand out condoms and diaphragms in the middle of nowhere. And we didn't have running water, and it was 40-degree heat, and I've got these perishable rubber items that I'm supposed to do something with. And kind of, I know you get this, right? So being a Kiwi, I'm like, could you send me some PVC pipe and some shovels? I could do a lot more for public health in this village if we rigged up some plumbing. And it was 8 hours by health department ute to the nearest phone. So, it'd taken me quite a bit of effort to get the ute to come and get me, to take me to the phone, to call these aid people. And they were like, no, you're there for contraception. And I'm like, well, no one's going to need contraception if we have much more diarrhoea, to be fair. And so, I ended up going back to uni, and by then I'd had my first child, and so I wanted to do engineering part-time, and I applied to Canterbury and got in, and then they said, well, we don't have a part-time program. And I thought, well, no wonder I was going to be the only woman in my class, But I did what a kind of enterprising Kiwi would do. I looked around the world and I went to the States instead. And so I ended up at Rutgers in New Jersey, and I ended up with this thing called an MCRAP, which hardly anybody knows, which I think is fantastic and so relevant, trust me. And so I specialised in waste management, but I also kind of got very interested in environmental epidemiology. So I ended up with this kind of double program, half at the Johnson & Johnson Medical School in environmental epidemiology, and I really specialised in environmental related disease, and then the other half in waste management. So you can kind of see where this is going a bit. And the other little bit of this story is that I had gone to an all-girls high school in a small country town in New Zealand. And that meant that in the last year of school, they didn't teach maths or science because they weren't girls' subjects, right? And so in order to do maths and sciences, I got bused to the local boys' school, which was actually quite a miserable experience for a teenage girl to be the only girl at a boys' school, and particularly the only girl taking like 7th form maths. But the thing that was genius about this was that it was the first year they taught coding in the applied maths program. And so I got to learn to code, and we went on a bus trip to Wellington to see a computer. It was very exciting. And I know, amazing. And I don't know if you can remember what government departments looked like in the 1970s, but for the young people in the room, humour me for a minute. I promise this whole talk is not going to be looking back. But they were long beige linoleum corridors, and they had windows that opened on the inside, and it was full of men in walk shorts and socks and sandals, smoking, okay? And I saw one other woman on this bus trip. She hit me with a wooden spoon. And the reason she hit me with a wooden spoon is I was an athlete. I was starving. I was a teenager, and I took a crispy and a ginger nut. And you were allowed one, right? Anyway, at the end of this miserable day with smoking men and walk shorts and getting smacked, they pitched to me that if I studied computer science, I could come and work there. And I was like, you have got to be joking, do you know? But where this was useful was that when I got to my master's, I was still the only person in my class that could code. And so I found myself always on people's study groups, and they'd want to be in my collaborations because I could get into the university mainframe, or I could hack my way into DARPA as it was, so the early internet, and I could download massive databases, and I would have to drink coffee all night and play computer games because it would take 8 hours to download a spreadsheet. But that was incredibly useful. And so, in the late 80s, I was trying to do two things. I was trying to write code that would predict where the next pandemic was coming from and how HIV was going to make its way through the New York population, which is where I was living. And then the second piece is that I was on all these big projects trying to work out how pollution was going to make its way through the Chesapeake Bay. And it turned out fluid dynamics was actually useful for both. And back then, trying to program fluid dynamics on a mainframe was pretty miserable, I have to say, and it's when you had to code to get onto the internet. Now, all of that kind of comes together because when I came back to New Zealand after graduating, I really wasn't sure what I was going to do. I had this weird combination of skills, and I had been consulting all my way through university, kind of not thinking I might actually ever be in business, just trying to pay off my student loan in the States as fast as I could. And so when I came back, I ended up working at Māori Whenua, which is the Māori Secretariat of the Ministry for the Environment, which was probably not on many people's bingo card. But the reason that really worked out for me is partly because I'd had that privilege of learning te reo, but also because I could see that this real idea that we were starting to explore when I was at university, as my first year at university in the States, we did all this cradle to grave stuff. And we were trained in particularly, if any of you remember what was going on in the States in the 80s, we had all of these really big RCRA sites, hazardous waste sites. We had big toxic fire at Port Elizabeth, which was very exciting for me, but it was sort of only 10 miles from my university. And so this whole discussion of what is product stewardship was changing quite rapidly in a way that we probably didn't necessarily at the time see where it was going. And so I remember actually taking a course in Cradle to Grave, it was called that. And so, we think about how do we do product stewardship. And then we had the pleasure of having a lecture from a couple of Michael McDonough and Braungart, and they hadn't written their books yet, but they were starting to think about these ideas of cradle to cradle, which really changed the way that a lot of us were thinking and made a whole lot of sense. And so when I got back to New Zealand and I got to work for Maru Whenua, I was the waste management analyst in the Māori division of the Ministry for the Environment. We got restructured and it was pretty obvious, like I was the Pākehā in there, so I managed to go and kind of figure out how to become the Māori advisor to the waste group instead of the waste advisor to the Māori group, which basically summed up my experience of working for government. And so anyway, but while we were there, we set up the Cleaner Production Association, and I got to chair it. Now, it didn't last all that long, but I was so excited, and I was sitting here today, and I was thinking, you know, sometimes you wish your 20-something-year-old you could see where things go, because I just remember it being so frustrating, and that frustration of youth too, where you know you're right, and that certainty that you have as a 20-something-year-old, and that certainty that you have that all the 60-year-olds in the room are clearly idiots. Do you know? And I'm sitting here as one of the 60-year-olds in the room thinking, oh my God, how exciting that so much has changed. The idea that this would be something that government supported, we really struggled to get interest, and we struggled even when we started to show people that, you know, how much money they could save with what they were doing. It just seemed like that was all sort of weird ideas. And I mention this because working as a futurist now, I constantly see things that are what I call signals from the future. They're like little outlier weird things that turn out to be absolutely mainstream within not that long. And okay, it may have taken 40 years on this one, but actually in the time span of our lives, and when we think about the invitation from Matua here about, you know, what are we doing for our grandchildren or their grandchildren or other people's grandchildren, I think there's that thing where we inexorably, you know, the research over the last 50 years is that the world is getting better, even if we go through some weird little kind of backward steps every now and then. You know, we're getting wealthier, there are more people who are literate, less people are dying in childbirth. You know, there's a bunch of these things, and they may go back and forth a little bit on the way to there. But even this idea that, you know, we're thinking about product stewardship, and we're thinking about what we used to call wastes really being, you know, inputs into other things, it's changed quite a lot. And so I want to talk to you a bit about strategic foresight and how as a futurist I think about the future. But it's this idea too that we are having to constantly make decisions under massive amounts of uncertainty. And, you know, we all think we're really special, but I look back and we've actually had quite a few periods of time in our history where there's been massive change. If you think about the arrival of Pākehā, whether, you know, they were bringing kind of germs, or they were bringing Bibles, or they were bringing themselves, you know, we've had huge periods of change there. Massive periods of change in my grandparents' lives. I remember my grandparents not having a phone and not having a TV, and arguing about indoor plumbing and whether it was worth bringing the outhouse in, and, you know, my grandfather having grown up in the Depression, not wanting to spend money that you didn't need to spend. And, you know, that must have, the changes in their lives must have been absolutely baffling and amazing. And then you can think back about Industrial Revolution or the Great Plague, or we've had other periods of time, but we all tend to think we're the most special, different, we're dealing with this for the first time, but we're really not. And as a futurist, I tend to think in these sort of 4 quadrants quite a lot. So I'm really interested in those big mega trends. You know, what's going on? Like, what are the drivers of change at a global level, and how might they be affecting the world around us? And I have to say, at the moment, I've got whiplash. You know, it's a bit hard to figure out what's going on. And I felt a lot more certain last year than I do this year. And even this morning, listening to Trump as I was walking here, I just have no idea what the plan is. Like, no idea. And I think that's actually quite a good reminder that the older I've got, the less certain I've got. And I think that's actually kind of a useful thing. So, you know, that thing about like leave home when you're 17 and know everything, I certainly know a lot less now. And then over on that side is what I call the wild cards. They're the things that often I've been trained to kind of try and figure out from a predictive analytics point of view. So I ended up writing software for actuaries, and writing software that would predict lifespans, that would predict treatment outcomes. So I spent most of my career in technology and in this predictive analytics area, and particularly what has turned into AI. I wrote my first line of code for that at university in 1986. And so for me, when I look around and everyone's like, oh my God, it's everywhere, I'm kind of like 40 years in the making, you know? Like, we've been down some real dead ends of programming. It's changed direction quite a few times. But I wrote some really big software in the 90s that ran a $190 million company that was all based on what we then called switch technology, which was just basically like a million lines of if-then code. Exhausting, but every Wednesday morning we would rewrite the code based on what we'd learned to get better at predicting stuff. And so that kind of, when's the pandemic, have we got volcanoes going? These are all things people are constantly working on. We know their certainties, we just don't really know the cycle they're on. And then on the other side is the trends bit. And, you know, this is sort of where I lose interest and the marketing department takes over. This is where, you know, I've only had COVID once, thankfully, but I lay in bed and watched really terrible TV, like the sort of TV I'd never watch in my normal life, because you could sort of fall asleep in a home decorating show and nothing had changed, right? And I thought about that because I thought, you know, when 9/11 happened, we saw a lot of people nesting, travel got dangerous, do you know? And so there was, again, this big rise of home decorating shows, people spending money on soft furnishings. And again, during the pandemic, we saw the same sort of thing. And working as a futurist, and I worked with quite a lot of primary sector companies, and I started to think about the supply chain disruptions that were going to occur. So my family thought I was ridiculous, but I emptied our garage, I filled it full of jib, and I hired the neighbour's driveway and filled it full of roofing iron. And I think I was the only person who managed to do an on-budget, like on-time renovation during COVID. But it was a mixture of that kind of, oh my God, if everybody else is watching this stuff on TV too, they're not going to travel, they're going to spend their spare money updating the kitchen, particularly if you've been stuck at home on Zoom for a few years. So I sort of lose interest a bit over there, but I think that's sort of where the money's to be made. And then the bit that I really love the most is like what we call weak signals. And so today I'm going to do a little bit of a mixture of what are a couple of those big mega trends I'm watching, and then what are some of the weak signals that I think are super interesting at the moment, and that might be interesting to you. So the first one is I just have no idea what's going on in geopolitics. And I'm really good at this. Like, I advise big companies like Fonterra and Silver Fern Farms and all sorts of people about like when to get out of what port and when to do stuff. I just have no idea. And I put this picture up because, you know, one day you've got Trump and Zelensky kind of slugging it out on TV, and the next day you've got him hanging out with all the leaders of Europe and taking a solidarity photo together. And it just feels at the moment like it's just kind of a bit hard to know, you know, who's doing what and why they're doing it and where it's going. But what I can say is one of the really good things about getting older is this too shall pass. Do you know, the good stuff passes, the bad stuff passes. It all kind of, I'm much more relaxed about it, and I'm much more relaxed about the not knowing. Do you know, because we know that in the end countries need trade, right? We know in the end that people need to feed their people and so on. So, you know, there's something going on in this sort of geopolitics, but I'm also kind of probably more relaxed than I was a few months ago. Climate change, you know, we've been talking about climate change for so long, and it feels like it's now finally part of the conversation. This is an old video from NIWA, but it's one of my faves. And back in 2020, when where am I? Getting all my dates mixed up. Back in 1990, when I was working for the Ministry for the Environment, one of the things I did was that I wrote a paper that said in 2022, Nelson would be underwater and we'd be dealing with a major pandemic. And we did a whole lot of scenarios around it, and we decided it was going to be dengue fever. And the reason that we decided it was going to be dengue fever is that this is just the most perfect place for a mosquito to live, right? And particularly when we started to use the NIWA models, even from back then, about the rainfall here, the temperature here, And so, when we looked back in 22, there were some pretty big floods here. We also looked at wind patterns, and it looked like it was going to be really easy for mosquitoes to kind of get blown over from Australia. Now, we did end up with a pandemic, and it was a different one. And then for those of you, I've been working on mostly animal pandemics now for the last 10 years. So I've worked on the M. bovis here, I've worked on avian flu, and I'm still doing a lot on avian flu in Australia. I've been working on African swine fever, and obviously COVID, but we're watching others. We had Japanese encephalitis break out in Australia, and it was absolutely drummed into me in my med classes that this was pandemic century, and that we'd done everything you would possibly do to ensure that this was pandemic century. We were just smacking it, we were doing great at it. And the two big things that we were doing especially well one was that we were causing climate change. And what that did is that the climate change piece just makes it a much happier place for any sort of insects that want to carry diseases around. We're just doing, we are really helping them out, So whether it's mosquitoes or whether it's fleas or whatever else it might be. And the second big thing that we're doing that we're really helping these pandemics along is the way that we do animal agriculture. And so, in particular, the way that we're expanding animal agriculture into new habitats. And so when we think about, where is the sort of the world demand for beef in particular, or the demand for chicken, or the demand for pork, what we're doing is that we're expanding into, South American rainforest, or expanding further in China. We're putting species together that have never cohabited. So you can think about what happened when we brought, my ancestors kindly brought all kinds of cool diseases like measles and stuff to New Zealand. We brought them, if you look at me, you can see that my ancestor is from the north. My ancestors literally shared a barn with animals for 15,000 years. Not in a creepy way, just in a keep warm way, right? I realised how that sounded, but that means that deep in my Scottish kind of North European, it's good, eh? Deep in my Scottish Northern European DNA is a whole lot of resistance to cow diseases in particular. But we've co-evolved, and so in that co-evolution, we've managed to find ways to become immune to each other's diseases. So what we do is we push animal agriculture out, particularly, I remember being super excited when I read the first genomic analysis of the COVID virus, and I sent it out to a bunch of my clients, super excited. Headline, none of them opened my email. And it was back in February of 2020, and what we could see was that we could see very clear genomic analysis from the bat to the pangolin to a human in a wet market. And there's no habitat in which the pangolin and the bat coexist. And so this is what I mean by this idea that we're pushing out, and the good news is only about another 2,500 coronaviruses and bats that we haven't had yet. But they are limited at this point, and so this idea of, how do we change when we change our environment? We're not just kind of changing the climate, but actually we're doing a whole lot of stuff that puts us at risk as well as other species at risk. And of course, some of what I'm watching with avian flu is that we can see that people can transmit this to their cats. So there's quite a lot of where are the kind of humans being able to transmit from human to other species as well. So anyway, the rest of it's more cheerful, don't worry. The other sort of megatrend that I'm watching quite a lot is just, peak population. And I grew up in the 70s with all that, oh my God, there's going to be too many people, it's all going to be terrible. And we've certainly seen great pressures on our environment from the number of people that we have. But other than Africa, pretty much everywhere else is at peak population now. Now, this has been really interesting because I work with forest owners as one of my clients. And of course, what we've seen some real kind of interesting impacts of population change in terms of the Chinese construction market, and others. So, if populations are peaking, what does that mean for our primary sector? And I think we're not really talking about this enough for the primary sector. We've got this big dependence on infant formula, and that has really been on the back of increasing population and increasing need for women to return to work. And so if you have a different dynamic, what will that mean? And we're seeing a lot of kind of wringing of hands around the world about why women don't want to breed. And I think you only have to ask a few, right? And I love my children, I just want to be clear, and I probably would have had more if I could have afforded it. But there's a bunch of this where we see that, in captivity, as it were, during COVID, women didn't really feel like popping any more babies out. And we know globally that the more educated women are, the less we have a lot of children, and also the greater the public health, the less we have children and our children survive. And yet what we're seeing is quite a few countries around the world legislating against contraception as a way of trying to increase population, or legislating against access to abortion, other health care. So we see this, it's not just the US, we can see it in Poland, we can see it in quite a few countries around the world. We see in Japan a number of the municipalities have set up speed dating as part of their council functions, so because they're worried that they're not going to have a rate space if they don't get more babies to pop out. But I think this is just worth it sort of bubbling along underneath, and it's worth having a think about, particularly as we think about the primary sector and where our markets are perhaps in 10 or 20 years' time, because when we're designing these new products, they might take 10 or 20 years to become commercialised. And so we need to have a good eye on, well, who's the target? Maybe there's today's target market, but what's the target market in the future? The other thing that we're seeing in quite a way that I put the slide in and out, but gender is changing, if you haven't noticed. Do you know? I mean, you got Winston Peters on the radio worrying about gender, and you've got someone like Musk who has what I've considered to have like gender affirming care. He's had plugs put in to cover up his bald spots. That is gender affirming care. So this big debate about what is gender affirming care, what are gender, how is gender. I think we need to be really aware that there always have been multiple genders, but the discussion and the debate that we're having around it now, I think will really change society. And I'm not trying to argue for or against anything here. What I'm saying is that this is something that you have to be really, really aware of. And I don't know what it means for us, but what I certainly see is related to that are these discussions about what is it to be self-determined, what is it to be self-care, how does this open up markets for skincare and ways and makeup and stuff that we hadn't necessarily thought of before. So I think if you're not kind of in the back of your minds, if you're thinking about a product that might be out there in 10 years' time, and you're not thinking about the changes we're seeing globally in gender and gender expression, I think you need to be really thinking about it. And then related to that is, obviously we've seen it in New Zealand, and while there's a long way for us to go, this kind of what is it for us to be bicultural has been a discussion that New Zealand's been in for quite some time, and I'm working with a big government agency at the moment on a program that will complete in 2040, and that will mean that government agency was originally the Colonial Office. It was the first government agency, and so if we think about the treaty, it literally was the crown that was created out of the treaty. And what does that mean for them on the 200th anniversary of that treaty? But when we look around the world, we're also seeing this kind of rise of Indigenous knowledge. It's always been there, but we're seeing it discussed in the mainstream in a way that I haven't seen in my career. So that anthropologist kind of scientist background of mine, I ended up working with Lakota Sioux as well on issues to do with uranium mining and women's health, and I've worked with Indigenous communities around the world on big environmental issues. But what I'm seeing now is a traction in a way that we haven't seen for most of my career. And here I think it's really interesting that the US government, really it's sort of the first time I'd seen them pay attention to Indigenous knowledge in many ways, saying, well, maybe we shouldn't be, sending human bodies off to the moon as a burial option. It kind of is a fascinating conversation, and I guess, you know, when you start to see that emerging, like, where does that conversation go next? So those are a few of the really big mega trends that I'm particularly interested in at the moment. And then at the signals level, signals are actual things. And this is what I like about this, is that as a futurist, might think I sit around and speculate about stuff. Well, that's a science fiction writer. It's something else. And if I had that skill, I'd probably do it. But what I'm really curious about is, like, what are the things that are actual things, actual products, actual artifacts in the world that I can start to look at. And I come back to, like, me, 1970s girl getting bused to a boys' school. It was a signal of where the future might be going. You know, me wanting to do engineering and being told I couldn't do it part-time because I was a mum. You know, that all of that has changed. I look at my youngest daughter's friends, you know, they've done science degrees, a heap of them are engineers. The school encouraged them to go that direction, and they've had they're having great careers. And so, you know, but you often see an outlier first. And so the same when I sort of first started reading the Cradle to Cradle material, and it took them almost 20 years to write that book, but they'd been having articles out there and discussions out there, and then I couldn't help but think about, you know, how important that book was in my career when I was sitting and watching all of what all of the partners are up to at the moment. So one of the big signals is obviously tariffs at the moment, but a second signal that I'm seeing really clearly is how do dying industries fight for their future? And what I mean by that is that the fossil fuel industry is in a sunset phase, except that when you read their strategy documents, and I spend quite a bit of time reading their strategy documents, their future is extremely rosy. And their future's really rosy for two reasons. One is that they are predicting a massive uptake in the use of plastic. And then the second reason that their future is really rosy is the massive uptake in agricultural chemicals. And so I find it really interesting because I sit there and I go, I'm not so sure that I'm really that excited about either of those. But actually, when you start to then look at the data that is out there, they're doing great at both of those. And I think this is an area where the signals are showing us that there's still a long way to go for those fossil fuel industries. I chair the Lines Company in Timaru, and the reason that I took that on is because 60% of the South Island's coal is used in Timaru. And the reason that we use it is exactly what that picture that was put up is, that it's used to make carrot juice, or it's used to dry wood, or it's used to make milk powder. So it's almost entirely used in the processing of food. And we're slowly managing to decarbonise some of the companies in there, but, you know, our plan is to really completely decarbonise South Canterbury, and to do that, to move them onto, you know, electricity. It's going to take some time, but that's still there. So, you know, but that conversion, the coal industry, the petroleum industry, it's fighting for other products, and I think they'll still do it for a long time yet. We're seeing, obviously, AI everywhere, right? It's just absolutely everywhere. I'm super excited about how this can be used to match products, to create new products, and I certainly think that we will be doing that. We've seen the identification of new antibiotics, which is amazing because we'd really given up on being able to find any more antibiotics. We're seeing Google DeepMind being able to be used to identify new materials and to really push material science. I'm super excited about a bunch of that. Some of it will turn out to be a hallucination. It's fine. That's like science. Do you know? We have to imagine things and then see if we can create them. So, but I think that you'll just find pretty soon the gnashing of teeth over a bunch of this. There were probably a whole lot of people that got really worried when we started using electricity in labs. You know, and it's just become a utility, and I don't need to be an engineer to flick a switch, and the same, I don't need to be a plumber to be able to use a tap. Very soon, I just see that what we currently are calling AI, these LLMs, they're just a utility. You'll be using them whether you know you're using them or not, without you even thinking about using them. not going to get into a big debate about good or bad. But I think too here, we're just going to see more and more companies too providing AI services for materials science, and I'm actually quite excited about a bunch of that. But what we're also seeing is that, and I've seen it, like here there was a Canadian lawyer who put together his brief and then went to court, and then turned out that the cases that he was citing, the AI had made up. And we're seeing quite a bit of that in science as well at the moment. And so this is not an ad for anything, but I use Perplexity a lot, and one of the reasons I use Perplexity is that it gives me the references for every recommendation or every item that it does. There are others, LibScribe, you can kind of put stuff through, but I really like Perplexity for that reason. And I think what's going to happen is that there'll be some of these mainstream, just like there was when we first did search, there'll be some mainstream search systems, and then there'll be some specialist ones. I used to have to use like Hotbot, and I used to have to use like 5 or 6 different search engines when I first was doing search on the internet, because not all of them searched all of the medical databases, say. And so, we'll see this proliferation of AI tools. At the moment, ChatGPT and Copilot are really winning, but there's a bunch of others. So, just keep your eye on that. I think it's just going to be in daily life. But I think a lot about my grandfather and the phone and indoor plumbing and how that was never going to happen. And, and then, like, really, what was that fight about? And I think the same around a bunch of the AI stuff. And so this idea that there are no future facts, I think, is a really important piece of where I sit in the work that I do. I do some work in predicting, and it's all short-term, and it's all specifically for clients, and all in the primary sector. But what's important here is that, we have trouble agreeing what happened in the past. And when I sit, like, almost always over a Chardonnay at a dinner party and start fighting for a point of view, I sort of slap myself and go, you know what, Mel, like, you don't know how it's going to turn out. You can have an opinion about how you think it might turn out, but that's not the same as being definite. So some of the stuff I'm really interested in is how we're seed banking, and I come back to climate change and the impact on our like biodiversity and on seeds and so on. So the seed banking's been really interesting, something that's been going on around the world for quite some time. Kind of baffled by the defunding of a bunch of this in the US. So, again, I think they're actually doing their agriculture a deep disservice by defunding these. We need to be thinking a lot about, what are the different wheat. I work for Grain Growers Australia, so we're thinking about what wheat will grow in Australia under different weather conditions. Not necessarily thinking about CRISPRing it, just thinking about have we got ancient strains that we can breed back in, and think about resilience. And so there's a bunch of this going on. We also, of course, I mentioned pandemic century, big defunding of bird flu programs. You've probably seen, 3 people have now died in the measles outbreak in Texas. So it's kind of like, it's fascinating for me over here. I would hate to be in the middle of that, hate to be one of my friends at the CDC. Half of them are no longer there. But this kind of, we are going into a period, in the next period, where I think we're going to see less control, and we've got less ability to perhaps do some of the global changes, global interventions and surveillance for pandemics coming up. Now, I mentioned like less babies being born. What's kind of interesting is at the same time we have this rise of lifestyle-related diseases. So in the States we now have 60,000 people on the waiting list for a kidney. I tried to get the AI to do me a picture of someone selling their kidney, and I was like, this guy's way too white and handsome. Then it gave me this sort of buff African-American quarterback-looking guy, like super cut, and I was just like, no, I think it needs to be a little poorer looking. And then the AI, like clearly the sort of anti-racism kind of guardrails came up, and we're like, no. But what we have is a big debates going on around the world about, should people sell their kidneys? And when we talk about should people sell their kidneys, what we mean is poor people, and we mostly mean poor women. And so if you start to think about this, there's kind of quite a lot of discussion in the world that I live in about the ethics of selling body parts and whether that is appropriate or not. And let me be clear, like rich white Americans don't sell body parts, right? And where that fits with you lot is that there's quite a lot of work going on around the world, including at CSIRO, on how might we CRISPR animals in order to be able to be a source of body parts. So when we think about, we've thought about meat, and I could sort of see up here, I sit on a meat company board, and we use every part of the animal that we can possibly get, and we try to get an ultra premium. We're 340 regen certified farms. We get extra for our runners in Japan, which are the guts that they use to make sausage casing. Like, we get ultra premium everywhere for every piece of this animal. But I was thinking, we still think about it as the meat industry with some byproducts. What if we thought about farming in a different way? What if we were thinking about farming for human body parts? Because partly nobody's having kids, so they're not dying as fast. And we have all of these people waiting. So I think it's kind of interesting here. So these are CRISPR'd pigs that have a lower rejection rate for organs. I'm not saying this is good or bad, right? I'm just saying that, like, when you're thinking about these wider products and what we should be thinking about, we might also want to be thinking more broadly about what are some of these big issues facing the world at the moment. I almost put the direwolves in here. Is everyone following the direwolf story? Oh my God, it's done my head in. Should we be CRISPRing animals back? And I gave this talk in Australia, and these three guys came up to me at the end of it, and I gave a very detailed talk. And they're like, do you know about our stuff? And I'm like, no. They're like, we're under NDA. I'm like, well, I know now. So it turns out they've been CRISPRing doves to try and bring back the dodo. And so what you do is you sort of find a common ancestor, and then you tweak the genes until you get it nearby. And then I kept thinking, it's interesting, isn't it? Like there are these two direwolves that are sort of direwolf phenotypes. So they're sort of almost direwolves. They're kind of fancy wolves with some square jaws. And then you sort of go, well, do they actually talk direwolf? Do you know? Or do other wolves just think they've got a weird accent? Do you know what I mean? Like what is it? And then do you bring back what they ate? Because can you really be a dodo without the dodo food? Do you know what I mean? Or are we just going to feed them, I don't know, like a bit of mince or something? I don't know. So I'm a bit kind of puzzled by some of this bringing it back. I get that we can, but I don't know if we've really thought through the full, what is it to be the only two direwolves? It turns out you're brothers. We call them Romulus and Remus. Oh my God. And then what? Do we now make a girl, and does she have to have a threesome with them? How does that all work, right? What's our kind of projections of all of this? And at the same time, I've been watching this massive growth in the use of AI to understand animal language. And I'm writing a book at the moment. This is a whole chapter on AI of animal language. But it's also why I'm kind of fascinated. So I was listening to those little direwolves squeaking on video yesterday, thinking, are they actually speaking direwolf? Do we know? And how do we know? And we think about language, and we certainly know that, again, Australian research shows there are 1,200 words that pigs use on a regular basis. And I know, I love that bit of body language. It's job done. And so I keep thinking about, how we got the little QR codes so you can see the happy kind of merino lambs frolicking that made your icebreaker jersey. I'm like, great, what if we have those little kind of cameras sitting in our pig facilities, and suddenly you can hear the pig going, please don't take my baby. And do you want that QR code on your bacon, right? So you've got to, I think there's a bunch of ethics issues that are coming at us in a way that we haven't necessarily thought about before, which this particular aspect of AI really opens up for us. And then I've been playing with Manus a whole lot lately. I don't know, what we see is that once someone cracks a problem, it becomes easier for everyone else to crack it, even if you're not necessarily taking someone else's ideas. And we saw, coming out of China, what we're starting to see is these sort of wrappers that can make things faster. So So I made a website in about 3 hours using these tools, Michelle Dickinson's got a great video on LinkedIn if you want, where she made a website of all the parks in Auckland in about 8 hours using Manas. I think we're going to see, like, there's just a bunch of this democratisation of AI that's going to change the way we do a heap of our tasks, not just sort of search and so on. But yeah, just sort of watch for this. I think that I think that, like, if you can remember a time before Google, you can remember a time after Google. Does that make sense? And I think that search is in for a huge shake-up. And one of the kind of last things I just want to talk about is that the original word for robots, like, they came from these cyborgs, and the idea was that they were going to be like human-machine kind of interfaces. And this is a little robot that is powered by mouse cells. So I kind of am curious about where does the whole interface of, you know, what do we implant in ourselves and how do we implant it? And I think that is about to change quite a lot. Obviously, you've got Musk with his Neuralink, but I think we'll start to see quite a lot of advancement in the next few years of the human-machine interface, particularly where what we've done is we might insert sensors into ourselves. You know, I'm seeing all the worried well at the moment, like you see them in the gym in Wellington with their what do you call it, you know, their sugar monitors, their blood sugar monitors, and they don't have diabetes, they're just trying to, like, get optimum fitness. What I would say is that, you know, we just sort of start to see more of this quantified self everywhere, and then human-machine interface. And then obviously space is also a big deal again at the moment. What is it to go to Mars? What is it to do this? And I come back and I feel like there's just another big land grab going on, right? So we can see it, what happened with Antarctica. We can see it with Mars and so on. And so a couple of last things I want to leave you with is pet food is going off, right? Amazing. This is one of my favourite Instagram feeds. It's a company in San Francisco called Dogue. They make degustation menus and patisserie for dogs. Oh, no. So you can bring your dog in for a 9-course menu, but you can only have a coffee. All of this is, like, made from liver and whatever. But I like it kind of because it's extreme, and you think, well, there are these people. Remember, falling birth rate, you still need something to love and adore you, so get a dog, right? And dog ownership globally exploded during the pandemic. And so, you know, I just still think there's masses of space for luxury dog stuff. And then we've seen this weird thing with, like, coming back, you remember I talked about gender? Gender is weird at the moment. And one of the ways gender's really weird is the genderisation of food, okay? So we're seeing this massive rise of the bros, the tech bros, doing the carnivore diet. There is one woman influencer in this space, but otherwise the influencers in the carnivore space are all men. And so this is where this gender thing, there's something going on here. And so, you know, they're all going to end up with kidney disease and bowel cancer, but they're going to feel really good until then, okay? So it's kind of fascinating. And then you see these men again, like in the don't die industry. And I found this fascinating. I can't find any women leading companies on longevity, which I don't know why that is. So that's why I think there must be something gender going on here. And I'm not trying to be mocking about this. I know it could sound like that. I don't mean it that way. But if it was sort of 50-50 women and men doing this stuff, I'd be going, okay, well, maybe there's nothing here, you know? But these guys just seem to be everywhere at the moment. Their lives look quite miserable, I have to say. By the time you've taken your 400 supplements and done a coffee enema, I think I'd be happy to die at 80. Do you know what I mean? Like, it just doesn't sound like fun. And I kind of am seeing on the women's side, what I'm seeing is women much more moving into that vegan plant-based food. So there are some male influences in the vegan movement, but it's mostly women. And I think that's really interesting as well. And I go every year to the States, I take lots of photos in supermarkets, and what I can't believe is just the proliferation of plant-based milks. like masses and masses of them. So to me, this is another area, potato milk was going off when I was there last year. But this whole plant-based, it's not going anywhere, but it is quite gendered. And of course leathers, so the pineapple leathers and so on, we're seeing them everywhere. And then, the last kind of thing I want to circle back to, I suppose, is part of what makes us different as a country. And part of what makes us different as a country is the treaty. And I couldn't believe my luck that today would be the day that this was going to Parliament when I put this in my presentation. But, this has smashed all records, and we've seen only 8% of the hundreds of thousands of submissions that were put on this bill supported the bill. And I know for a number of my Māori whānau that they've been really dismayed by it even getting this far. But what I can say is, when you look back to that rise of the Indigenous, what is it for us to be a bicultural nation? This is so in our conversation now, we can't separate it out. And it is also a huge piece of just who we are, You're overseas and you see the haka on TV and you still cry, it doesn't matter how you were raised or how it works. So thinking about that, and I just want to leave this last piece around, how do we not appropriate mātauranga, how do we support mātauranga, because there is a lot of that can be really useful and makes us different. So how do we support Māori scientists, how are we going to support Māori engineers, and how are we really going to think about that in the future? And I want to tie that back to the birth rate. So the median age for Pākehā in New Zealand is 54. The median age for Māori in New Zealand is 19. That means that if you are thinking about where your workforce is coming from in the next 10 years, unless we're going to do mass inwards migration, they're going to be Māori young people, and they're going to be Māori young people that we need to get into our skill sets, we need to bring into the workforce. And the ownership of Māori in the primary sector is massive, and that's largely where we're going to be working in this sector. So that ability to really understand, what can we learn from mātauranga, how do we support that, and how do we really think about how that makes us different is hugely important. So if you want my slides, you're welcome to them, and I'm done. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Melissa. Amazing and quietly soothing that this too shall pass. Really needed to hear that today. And lovely to see BPA supported project Kabocha Milk up there. Thank you. And I think Nick's somewhere. We do have time for questions, and Kate and I will be running the microphones. So hands up, questions.
Or comments. You're allowed to argue, right? There's no future fact. Yeah. Here we go. Michael. Oh, yeah.
That was absolutely fascinating.
Oh, you're welcome.
So many questions. I'll just try and come up with one coherent one. You talked about looking forward, if you're producing a product, looking forward to what the future market is, makes sense. I'm wondering in terms of people and science in general, also, and you touched on this, looking forward to see the potential harms of technologies and where you would think regulation would fit in that space.
Yeah, I love this question. I guess after a 40-year career, I just think regulation is always lagging. And it may be that that's just how it has to be. It feels like big debate about whether pines should be in the ETS or not. We've known for whatever it is now, 40 or 50 years, that New Zealand was going to be impacted by climate change, but we've kind of not done anything about it. And so my experience is that industry leads, and I'm not always a big private sector rah-rah, but industry leads and regulation follows. So I kind of think it's probably just got to be that way. Yeah, great question. Yeah. Somebody else? Somebody. Otherwise I'm like, oh my God, did I bore you all?
Yeah, fantastic, thank you. I'm actually really curious about your perspective on the Gene Technologies Bill and where you see with your insights, where you see that kind of landing?
Yeah, great. I should disclose that I worked for Plant and Food on some other stuff. So I did some consultation with the hort industry on gene technologies just over a year ago. And that really influenced the way I thought, actually. So, and also the work I've been doing in Australia. So two things. I sit on the board of a company called Atkins Ranch. We're a lamb company. We only export to the US. We raise animals up from Tairāwhiti to Masterton, so it's quite a small patch. We get a ultra premium, so we get the highest price per lamb of any meat company in New Zealand, and we're pretty highly profitable. We're going to have another great year, right? And we get a premium for no GMO in our feed. And we can't identify exactly how much of a premium that is. And so the research that I've done in the US is that I've found that to get a premium for a food product, you need 3 claims. And you don't necessarily get more for 5, but you need 3 claims. And so for us, it might be antibiotic-free, GAP4, so high animal welfare and no GMO. If you did one of those on your own, you're not really going to get a premium, but once you bundle them together, we find that we can get a good premium. And then for some of our clients, we add certified regen with Savoury Institute on top, we get another premium. So we submitted separately from the MIA, from the Meat Industry Association, and we said, look, we get a super premium. We've met with a bunch of the politicians to ask them to be respectful of that. So the MIA put in a submission going, let it rip, basically, with a small paragraph saying Atkins doesn't agree, and then we put in our own. Having said that, I support the definitions that the UK legislation has, which separates gene editing from genetic modification. And I think that's actually really important, and I think part of us having a kind of an adult conversation is that we do need to be clear about which technologies do which. And so the UK legislation, which I think is really good, defines it as basically if it could have occurred in nature, we will take that out from the definition of genetic modification. And so personally, I am in support of technologies which can speed up the development of, say, a new apple cultivar, but they're not transgenic. And it's not because I have a fear of something or I'm being irrational. I'm just really clear about I know what our market wants, and I think there's an important piece there to think about. I know that our clients will pay extra for that. So one. The other piece that I am a bit concerned about, and it comes back to mātauranga, is that when we consulted with Māori, and when you read the quite a lot of the research that's been put out about Māori views on genetic editing, we see that you shouldn't mess with whakapapa from a mātauranga point of view. And so if you can show that what you've done is kind of kept the whakapapa lines, then there's not an issue from a Te Ao Māori point of view. Where that gets tricky is that to use a CRISPR tool, you are in fact introducing extra genetic material, even if you then remove it. And I feel like there's this massive, sorry for those of you who've just lost, but I think there's a massive opportunity for us to think about how we might develop genetic editing tools that were in alignment with mātauranga. Because I think there's a global market for that kind of technology. Does that make sense? So I know that's probably a more complicated answer than you were expecting, but I am in support of the use of editing tools. I'd like there to be more editing tools. There hasn't been, I think, enough development of new editing tools over the last few years. And I feel like if you could do that in line with mātauranga, there will be a global market for that kind of specific. Yeah? Is that okay? Yeah? I mean, anyone's welcome to disagree with me. It's my opinion. It's not a fact, right? So, yeah. Yeah. This is like doing a Viva.
No, I'm kind of following on from that
Yeah.
point. I'm quite interested in that crossover between, I guess, the climate change-driven pandemics through, greater proliferation of insects like mosquitoes, and then that CRISPR space where through nationalism, one country may choose, an option, which then affects the entire planet on,
Yeah.
you know, if one species of mosquito is affected, those don't, you know, adhere to certain borders. So what are your thoughts, I guess, in that space?
Well, we kind of already see it, don't we? In that, if you look at what's happened with seeds and seed banking, and that, you know, can someone patent a seed and can they own it? And if that seed blows in and cross-pollinates with the seed in my farm, can I actually lose the right to do my own seed saving? And I think we can see, you know, that's why I like the look back to look forward. You know, can I find a parallel? And we can see that it's that release of some of those technologies has really taken kind of autonomy away and has also changed ownership rights. So not only might they release that specific mosquito, but does Monsanto own that mosquito? And therefore, if you're found in possession of it in your pond, do you owe them a royalty for having it on your land or something? There's a whole bunch of those things that need to be asked. And what worries me, and this is why I think the geopolitics is so important for us to understand, is that something is currently unravelling in the social framework of our geopolitics. So we have kind of had definitions of who's a friend and who's not for quite some time. It's very strange to think that you know, NATO might not have America in it, and America might be Russia aligned. You know, that wasn't something that was really obvious to us a few years ago, and what that might mean for science is quite concerning. And the same, if we lose trust through the kind of trade wars, do we then lose trust in our science institutions? And I can look back again and find another example, which is, you know, when the UK left Brexit and then found itself outside of a lot of the research funds and a lot of PhD students finding themselves unable to access, you know, Erasmus grants and kind of money in Europe. Like these things, and that's why I like signals, because you can kind of start to put them together and go, is that a pattern? And so I love what you're asking there, because for me it's the question that's more important than the answer. And I you know, when you start to scenario some of this out, it really worries me for our science communities what these lack of trust at the international level means. And then when you start to release new technologies and have people who think they're entitled to do it, yeah, that scares me more than some of the other stuff. Great question.
Melissa.
Yeah.
Hi. I just wanted to ask about the increase in awareness around Indigenous. Do you think that's a response to all the other technology that's like going way out there and people just want to come back to what they feel is natural? Or what do you think the rise in that is about?
I think there's a few things. I mean, I guess like I look at somewhere like Wales, right? Wales just kind of really got to a point of going, we really want our own identity, and as part of that we want our own language. And I think what we've seen is that we just see there's a part of it that might be others kind of wanting to learn, but there's also just enough and no further, you know. And there has just been a global movement of young people wanting to reconnect to who they are. Interestingly, at the same time, you see the whole growth in genealogy amongst sort of non-Indigenous people too, right? So we're seeing the growth of the Ancestry.coms and these big kind of, you know, people marketing to me that they'll find my ancestors for me or whatever. So I can't really tell, you know, but I think it's such, again, a great line of inquiry. But a heap of it has been knowledge holders, you know, building enough capability and fighting for their own right to be heard as well. So I think there's two sides of that. Yeah. Curious. I don't know. Again, we should have dinner. Isn't that great dinner party conversation? Yeah, over there.
Thank you.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Shout out to the woman who studied engineering. Love that. So much content, thank you. I'm just thinking about other weird and
Awesome.
outliers in this world, crazy world, thinking about the alternative economic systems and wondering about products that we produce and the need for them, and how it's concepts like post-growth, degrowth, economics, you know, alternative economic systems, and how you see industry-led solutions that are focusing on that future
Yeah,
state.
I love that. I sat on the government's Green Growth Advisory panel kind of 10 years ago, and I was the only one there who was saying, you know, should we be doing growth at all? Should we be talking about degrowth? And it's like, this is a panel, you know, it's a national government appointed panel to talk about growth. But, you know, I think about even things like us at Atkins Ranch. We know that we can't produce any more animals, and we're probably going to produce less. And in order, if you look at the sheep industry in New Zealand, we've halved our number of animals and doubled our profits as a whole sector. And I think that, you know, I sat on the board at Beef and Lamb and talked a lot about destocking. And I think we have to think about how do we destock. You know, this discussion about, again, pine trees this morning on the radio, like we have to stop it. We have to reduce our emissions at source. You can't just kind of, you know, offset them. I think there are more and more companies around the world, you know, who are thinking about this. And you can think about the Patagonias and the kind of companies that are thinking about how do we feed people in a world, how do we produce products that people want. We've seen, like, again, I think about this whole cradle to cradle, you know, you see the green dot stuff in Europe, you see just the growth of product stewardship and returning things. Personally, you know, I think recycling is just bogus, but that's not what I'm about here, you know, this idea of really can we keep taking inputs. We see the growth of, you know, in the New York Times yesterday, there's a guide to Paris's second-hand clothing stores. Do you know, that's a signal for me. We see more and more young people wanting to do, you know, buy second-hand clothes, thinking about how they reduce their consumption. I think if we ignore that, we ignore it at our peril, and that may not be everybody, because at the same time you see the rise of Shein, right? And I think that's this thing about the world is really contradictory. So in New Zealand, we're tiny, we're going to follow small niches. We don't need a massive niche, and if we follow a niche that is thinking about how to produce fantastic products that nurture the earth, that nurture our customers, that nurture the planet, that have been grown well, that nurture our farmers, all of those, we can do that here. We're the size of Melbourne, for God's sake. You know what I mean? Like, we're the size of Philadelphia. So I think sometimes too we try to think we have to solve everything, but we don't. So I know, a bit of editorialising there, but I am seeing that. But at the same time, you still see the rise of fast fashion. You still see the rise of Coca-Cola thinking that they're going to be able to sell more plastics. You still see the rise of the you know, big industrial kind of fertiliser. Coming out of the fossil fuel industry, and they think they've got a good 20 or 50 years of that, and they're probably right. So I think we need to think much more about ands. Where are the yes ands? Yeah, Daniel.
In regards to methane mitigation and red meat, obviously playing into all of those trends being natural, regenerative, this sort of doesn't really fly with that. How do you see that playing out in New Zealand in a pastoral grazing systems with?
Look, I think meat should be a treat that you have every now and then. And, you know, epidemiologist in me, World Health Organisation says 100 grams 3 times a week. If you decided to save that up and have a leg of lamb on a Sunday, all good. Do you know? But I think that this idea that people should eat meat 3 times a day, we see that we have so many more diseases around the world, and particularly in developed countries, from the overconsumption of meat than we do from the underconsumption. I think protein is the next sugar, which is not always a very popular thing to say in the meat industry. But, you know, the reason that there's those 60,000 people needing kidneys, a heap of it is their overconsumption of protein. So we've been sold a big story about protein at the moment. It's very hard to find anyone in New Zealand who has a protein deficiency. And so I guess that's where I sit. Like, I really feel like we need to be thinking about meat as a treat. And that's how we think about it at Atkins. And if meat is a treat, then you don't have to have it every day, and maybe you pay a pound more for it. And you're willing to pay more for it because the genetics mean that it tastes amazing. The feed means that it tastes amazing. You feel good about how it was produced, and we sort of go, happy, 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 oops, dead. You know, like, it's had a great life until it was dead. You know, you've got to get over that kind of dead bit, and not everybody, you know, we see this rise of veganism, and it's not a massive rise, but I still think that there are more and more concerns from people about the ethics of eating animals. But for the people who will eat animals, I just don't need to eat so many. Yeah, I know, not always popular. Yeah. Yeah.
Kia ora, Melissa.
I know, and then we can carry on over morning tea or something.
Hi, Melissa, thanks. Just really keen on your insights around localisation versus globalisation in the current environment.
Yeah, the local global thing, it's one of those sort of big mega trends I've been kind of following for a long time. It feels to me like people like both, it's kind of it's a both and, right? So I've been curious about, country of origin labelling. I want to know where my food comes from. However, what the research on a lot of the country of origin labelling has shown is that it reduces sales, right? So quite a lot of the meat companies, for example, don't want country of origin labelling because if it said it came from Mexico or it came from Denmark or it came from New Zealand, maybe it doesn't actually improve sales. So I think we're going to continue to see global supply chains. I made my dress. I bought the wool in the UK. It's made from New Zealand wool, milled in Italy, bought in the UK, brought back to New Zealand. Like, we are still going to be part of a global supply chain, right? And I think that that's part of what we sort of have to understand. And the US at the moment might think they're going to onshore a whole lot of like manufacturing jobs and people screwing in the screws on the iPhones, but it's not going to happen because Americans aren't going to be willing to spend $3,500 for an iPhone. And so that's the tricky bit, but they might be really willing to pay extra for coriander that was grown down the road or oranges in season bought by the side of the road. And I think you have to just accept as human beings we are messy and contradictory. Yeah? I love your dress. Thank you. I think we had one over there somewhere. Yeah?
When you look at the surprises we've seen with climate change, they're all being bad.
Yeah.
Mother Nature will have a reaction. Is there any sign that's anything other than an extinction event? Is there any?
Oh, that's brutal. I love it. Nikki goes, "Oh, your presentation was soothing," and then let's finish with a mass extinction event. Look, 99% of the species that have been on the Earth don't exist anymore. We've done quite well at extinction events, I think, so far. I think we're still continuing. I guess part of what worries me, and I gave a bit of advice to Doc with avian flu, we're a country of birds, and so avian flu gets settled into our native bird population and their toast, right? And I think we keep thinking about it as just agriculture. Obviously, I work with the egg industry, and we've had to kill quite 160,000 chickens down here in the South Island. I think we're pretty good at those extinction events. I think we're going to get better at them. I don't know how else to describe that. But I do, and I worry for young people. I guess this is that thing about really keeping the puna ki te puna, from our tupuna down to our mokopuna. How do we think about that? Because, I look at my youngest, and, she did most of her master's degree online. She's grown up in a world where it's fairly grim and the grown-ups haven't actually done their job, And so I remember even when she was, I took 2 years off and went and volunteered with Al Gore in Nashville, and she came with me, and I remember her just feeling really depressed that there were going to be no animals left when she grew up. And of course it hasn't quite turned out like that, but you can see why that generation is, no wonder they're sad, Anyway, can we have one happy one to finish on? I've got 2 here or over there or something, and then we'd better go to morning tea. Yeah.
So I'm just coming from a design perspective because
Awesome.
I'm a designer and I work in film, and most of the time I see a lot of waste coming around that as well.
Oh, yeah.
But I do want to just talk about, because I love indigenous fabrics, indigenous materials, because that's coming into the world as well. And I went to the Philippines, grabbed some pineapple fabric, and
Nice.
I really want to see the rise of muka fabric as well here in New Zealand. Is there any I don't know what your prediction is in terms of this, seeing it forward. Do you see a lot more natural fibers coming from our land to be able to see it in the industry? Because we do want to reduce plastic, we do want to reduce a lot of the use in terms of the fashion industry of polyester.
Yeah.
So do you see any advancements in terms of using indigenous materials, natural fibers here in New Zealand, or not in general?
I see it globally, and like I follow a bunch of designers, and it's actually really helped us how we think about things at Atkins Ranch, right? So I'll give you just a little story. So Atkins Ranch, we thought we were really pretty cool because our skins went from Napier to Christian Louboutin pre-pandemic. So for people who don't know what Christian Louboutin is, it's, you know, they made like the world's most expensive high heels basically, and then our bee skins went to a clothing designer in Germany, and we got a really good price for those because they were, you know, the highest level of farming possible, really high quality skins, and but the whole story behind it really helped us. Anyway, I'm busy forecasting all this pandemic stuff, and I'm busy figuring stuff out for, like, you know, what should be on what boat and where are the ships going and where's COVID and what port and when are they collapsing. And I just didn't even stop and think that no one was going to buy high heels for 3 years, right? And no one was going to sit around and Zoom and leather pants, right? So we went from really feeling like we were the bomb, right, to composting our skins. And it was heartbreaking. So we'd gone from getting a couple of $100 for this thing to spending $20 each to send them to a compost facility. And then we're like, okay, what are we going to do with that? And so, you know, we thought about this quite a lot, and we started talking to some of our farmers about taking that compost, and could we use that compost to do something with it? Can we use it as an input for our farms? And so we had 10 farms that were willing to go into a trial with the Savoury Institute, took the compost. We started to do a conversion to, you know, to regen farming. And then we had 50 more who sat on the waiting list and who joined us. And then we got a call from UGG. And UGG called and they said, we want to do a regenerative boot, but we can't get anyone in Australia who can give us the skins that we want, that can be certified regen. And we're like, we're in, do you know? And so out of that, we ended up with a contract, and they developed a specific boot for us. That was because our skins were different from Australian skins, and they sold them for $40 more US a pair than their regular boots. There was a massive waiting list. They sold them all out. They ended up with American Indigenous models as their spokespeople, talking about the way we farm, but they didn't let them know that they were Kiwi farms. But, you know, we got this massive premium. Now, what's happened, of course, is the Aussies have figured it out and caught up now. But we'll be looking for where's the next moat, as we call it, like where's the next level. So we watch people like Gabriella Hurst and a bunch of Stella McCartney, and there are a whole lot of leading, like, fashion designers around the world who get ultra premium for their products and only use certified products, like whether it's GOTS or whether it's like regen or whatever it is. You know, one of the Gabriella Hurst, her lambskin coats sell for 14,000 US, right? And she pays her farmers well. They come from a certified organic regen farm in Italy. And so for me, it's that thing again about we don't have to do mass market because we only got 340 farms, right? Like, and I think New Zealand, we don't always have to do that mass market, and I think you'll start to see that muka is turning up in other places, and it's resilient. It can grow in quite a lot of, you know, conditions. We're starting to see, you know, with Francine, we're starting to see like use of other materials, feathers and all sorts of stuff. So I just think, you know, that look back to look forward, there's a whole lot of resilience in mātauranga, whether it's ours or whether it's other, you know, whether it's New Zealand, Aotearoa, or whether it's from somewhere else. But at the same time, the fossil fuel industry is fighting for its future. If it can sell more polyester, it's going to. And I think that's the thing, is you have to hold the dichotomies, hold the polarities, and hold them really lightly, and understand it's not a failure if polyester grows at the same time. It's just kind of how the world is. Yeah, which might be a good note to finish on. I just thank you so much. Like, you know, I was kind of like, oh, I don't know, is this like, do you really want to talk about, I don't know, a specific kind of product or something? So just thanks for making me feel so welcome. And for the younger people in the room, I know it's like really frustrating how slow people are, but just remember, like, hopefully you'll sit in a room and at the other end of your career and you'll look back and you'll go, oh my God, all those people who told me that this was a stupid idea idea or it would never work. It becomes mainstream over time. It just takes time. And if you're not pushing for it, it's not going to change. But at the same time, understand that there's a lot of you out there doing the right stuff, and things are always moving forward, even if we have a few steps backwards along the way. All right, kia pai te rā.